Hi everybody. Kia ora koutou katoa, i ngā maunga, i ngā awa, i ngā kāranga rangamaha. Kei te mihi tēnei kia koutou katoa, kua tae mai I te rānei. Kei te mihi hoki ki te mana whenua, kai Tahu, tēnā koutou. Kei te harakoa hau, kei te tūtahi tātou I tēnei kaupapa. He mihi māhana ki a Dr. Lyn Carter. Nāna te kōrero I whakarite mō tēnei hui. Nā reira, Lyn, me mihi koe kātika. Ki te OCNET, Otago Climate Change Network, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Ko Kate Turner toko ingoa, no Otipoti ahau, ki te mahi au I te OCNET. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora everybody, welcome to our third session for Conversations on Climate Change for the Otago Climate Change Network. My name is Kate Turner and I've got the privilege of introducing Lyn today for her talk. Dr. Lyn Carter, she's of Tahu, Kati, Mamoe and Waitaha iwi. She's a senior lecturer at Te Tumu School of Maori, Pacific and Indigenous Studies. Lyn coordinates and teaches in the program for Indigenous Development. She's the principal investigator for 2 National Science Challenge research programs. The Bioheritage Project explored the use of Indigenous knowledge in climate change, adaptation for mahi kakai or resources. The Building Better Homes, Towns and Cities project investigates how Martotaka Maori can become an integral part of the New Zealand cadastral system in urban and semi-urban planning and development. She works with Dr. David Goodwin of the Department of Surveying and PhD candidate James Bergen on the Building Better Homes, Towns and Cities project. She has worked with Dr. Diane Urufu of Otago University Business School on a Ngā Pāo Te Maramatanga funded research project investigating small to medium Māori enterprises in the Māori economy. However, her main research area has a key focus on Indigenous development and sustainability in the context of climate change. Lyn has published widely in academic journals and books and presented at a number of international and national conferences, including as invited keynote speaker. Her most recent publications include the book Indigenous Pacific Approaches to Climate Change, Aotearoa New Zealand, of the Palgrave Macmillan series in disaster studies. So with that, Lyn, I'll give it over to you. Kia koe.
Tato, can you hear me up the back? Because I talk quietly. Okay, so I was only expecting half a dozen people and maybe a few on Zoom. So, mi atu kia koutou mō tō haringa ki au, kia whakarongo ki au I tēnei ahi. Nō reira, mihi atu kia koe Kate mō tō karanga ki au, I pāna ki tēnei hui o te climate change. And mihi also to all those in Zoom and other people who are going to maybe be in another room, apparently. So full house. So I hope I've got something interesting to say. Okay, so just to start, as Kate said, I'm from Kaitahu, Kati, Mamoe and Waitaha. My hapu are Kati Hoirapa, Kati Hawea and Kaiterua Hikihiki, which and I'm centred at Karatani, just north of Dunedin. So my talk today is considering how Indigenous peoples have been thinking, acting and adapting to challenges from climate change in their countries over at least the past 2 decades, and how their actions could contain valuable lessons for us all, particularly New Zealand, who's entering into some massive changes and upheavals over mitigation and adaptation in this country. So, for example, Pacific Island countries began raising awareness as early as the 1990s and have continued to do so, as well as taking measures to adapt to the changing conditions that in many ways have been imposed upon them through the actions of their larger industrialised cousins and larger industrialised neighbours. I'll be focusing mainly on adaptation, but do acknowledge that to date New Zealand has been more about mitigating the effects of greenhouse gases, the most recent being the Zero Carbon Bill. And also that we've also seen the formation of a number of groups here in New Zealand, such as Generation Zero and 350 Aotearoa, the later, who have been pretty vocal just recently in supporting some of the protest events that have been happening around New Zealand. And it's also been really heartening to see the rangatahi or the youth protesting about taking action, time for action, and shaking up the people and some of the complacency within Aotearoa New Zealand. But moving on to the Pacific. Okay, so there's two things in this slide, the photo and the heading. Now the photo shows rangatahi or youth from different Pacific Island countries who call themselves the Pacific Climate Warriors. Some of you may have been onto their website called Have Your Say, with say being spelled S-E-I, and referring to the flower that people put behind their ears in some Pacific countries too, which is symbolic of their way of talking about resilience in the Pacific in the light of climate change. Now I'm showing this because there's been some thinking that the global youth movement against climate change began in 2018 with Greta Thunberg when she protested outside the Swedish Parliament. But in fact, Pacific youth and other Indigenous peoples have been fighting, protesting and raising awareness and also adapting to climate change and its impact on their countries for quite some time before that, and have been part of Indigenous knowledge-framed protest systems and processes for adaptation. This particular group were present in Australia in 2013 during a World Leaders Forum that was held there. Now, many of them sailed waka or canoes from their homelands in the Pacific across and down to Australia as a way of raising awareness of their mission. And what they also did when they were there was use those same waka to block the Newcastle port of Australia, which is the biggest coal port in Australia. And they blocked the entrance of that for a day to protest about the fossil fuels situation. So it was reported at the time, but the most common way to view and learn about their other protests is to look at their own website, because they're not widely reported and they don't make the global news like a lot of other global protests have. I'm not suggesting that the more recent Youth for Climate Change protests are not relevant, are not valuable, or do not raise awareness, just that for some Indigenous peoples there's been a lot going on in the past 20 years. Okay, the second is about the headline. Now the headline's from an article by Brittany de Guara, who spoke about the adaptation measures happening in the Solomon Islands, and in particular the experiences of families such as Josephine Langi. Now she states, the sea is slowly swallowing, Josephine's small island falls to the whim of a changing climate. Her family have lived in the Solomon Islands for generations. The rising seas are stealing the beaches. Everything is changing for the worse, but they are adapting. And Josephine Lange herself says that her family wouldn't want to leave their homes as a result of climate change. They will adapt. Leaving is a final resort. This is the birthplace of our ancestors and our forefathers and is being handed down from generations. And so moving away would be a challenge that may or may not be inevitable, end of quote. Now in the same article, there is a warning about how we often speak about Pacific Island peoples and other Indigenous peoples and smaller minorities in terms of climate change. And it is being referred to as a climate change refugee. Now this may be okay, but just be considerate of the situation because some people may or may not want to be referred to in that way. They have their own voice and it's time to listen. So for most, such as Josephine's whānau, leaving is not an option. Adaptation is, and the adaptation measures are being framed from their own knowledge frameworks, the Indigenous knowledge processes and systems of the Solomon Islands. This is being repeated across the Pacific and across other global Indigenous communities. So for example, in 2005, the Arctic Council released a report of the impact from climate change across the Arctic countries. And this is Norway, Sweden, Finland, Greenland, the northern part of the American continent, Russia, some of these, and a lot of other countries that all fringe in part of the Arctic Circle. So the report included extensive Indigenous knowledge and its usefulness in understanding the short and long-term changes and future challenges. This included areas of sea level rise and food sovereignty, environmental changes that impact on livelihoods, and the cultural and social sustainability. Adaptation measures featured large inside this report. Now, the report is available online. It's huge. It's a book, well, 10 times the size of War and Peace. But it's actually really important, and it's good reading, very good reading about what is happening amongst Indigenous peoples in that part of the world. In 2006, the Northwest Indian Applied Research Institute at the Evergreen State College published a report that details climate change impacts for Pacific Rim Indigenous peoples, including New Zealand. The authors argued that on a region-by-region basis, Indigenous peoples hold a collectively powerful body of climatological knowledge, which is holistically interwoven and part of an environmental knowledge of a culture. On the African continent too, and in the Torres Strait, there are growing bodies of research that investigate the role of Indigenous knowledge in strategies that combine mitigation and adaptation policies and actions. This has been described by Indigenous scholars as not a completely new idea, that is, the combining of the two, and has been successfully used by Indigenous peoples for some time. Moving on though, in its fourth report, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change called for Indigenous knowledge to be utilised in climate change adaptation because it is local, intergenerational and part of everyday lives. It is lived reality for Indigenous peoples. It has been built up over generations of experience and environmental disasters and change, and continues to inform how these challenges are being met. Local knows best, and you can't ignore the generations of knowledge and actions that have helped them to remain vital parts of their environment. How we understand that intertwined reality is important in understanding how we can move with the changes and establish new ways of living our lives. This relies upon understanding how we fit within the environment in which we live. In particular, this talk will focus on Pacific peoples who are part of the environment through beliefs, values, knowledge, practices, and will experience substantial challenges to lifeways. This includes Aotearoa New Zealand, which of course is also a Pacific Island country. But to understand what grounds Indigenous knowledge, let's start with where I'm connected to it all through whakapapa and intergenerational experiences, practices, and values here in Te Waipounamu, South Island of New Zealand. Oh, and mihi atu ki a koe, Pinirangi, one of my kaumātua. Okay, so this is my place. As you can see, Kohikoroa Te Mauka, it's the main mountain. Well, you can just see it actually, just tucked up behind the word, or just above the words Ngā Waka. And of course, that's Karatani Estuary and the little village of Karatani, which of course is the centre of the universe. So this is where my whakapapa interlinks with the landscape that defines us as Kati Hoirapa Hapu at Puketeraki. We are part of the myriad of intergenerational relationships that make up the ecosystems that transform and inform the landscape and all things part of it. Here is where climate change will impact most for Kati Hoirapa. And we are not leaving, like Josephine and her family, we're pretty much staying to see it out. But we are seeking how to adjust and ensure that the relationships we've established over generations can survive, albeit through new rules for engagement. So just as in the Solomon's Island example, we inherited these lands and waterways from our ancestors and their experiences in forming and managing relationships with everything else within the ecosystem. And that's what guides us now. Our relationships and how we conduct them with the same lands and ecosystems will guide us into the future and be part of what informs future generations about managing those relationships and adjusting to change. Knowledge comes from the land and the way we know ourselves to be part of that land. Our connections determine our associations, our origins, our history, our present and our futures. So this is all known as, in a general term, mātauranga, which means knowledge. And mātauranga explains how we have used relationships to develop our lived world. This informs how we engage with other parts of the ecosystems and shape, manage and govern our environment. Knowledge informs how relationships were formed, how we negotiated changes and adjustments, how these experiences can inform our present relationships and lead us towards future adaptation strategies and practices in this era of climate change. But Puketaraki is the centre of a bigger landscape and series of connections. So our territory, our Hapu regional territory, our takiwā, goes from the mountains to the sea. That is Kiuta ki Tai. And of course, it goes into the areas where our ancestral mountain, Aoraki, is situated. So from the mountains, lakes and rivers of central Otago through to the East Otago coastline and beyond to the continental shelf is the vast territories of Kati Huirapa. We share some of those with other runanga within Ngāi Tahu, such as Moeraki to the north of us, or Tako over to the east of us on the peninsula, and of course some of the southern runaka who also whakapapa into that Central Lakes district. So it's a diverse landscape, it's diverse impacts, and it'll need diverse solutions, strategies and approaches to help minimise the impacts. So climate change is an environmental disaster, but we have encountered disasters in the past, and from our responses to these, we can inform how we will deal with them now. But first, to set the scene about the origins of land across the Pacific, that considers land and sea as seamless extensions of each other. Land and sea being the climate change battlegrounds, and Pacific peoples have stories of how these came about and how that interprets their understanding of the world. Right. Across the Pacific, there are many oral traditions and histories of how the land came into being. And as Patrick Nunn succinctly put it, it was either fished up or thrown down. Many were the result of Maori fishing for the land below water and raising it up to the surface, such as here with our great fish of Maui, Te Ika Maui, or North Island. Others were the result of the ocean forces throwing it down, such as the South Island of New Zealand, Te Waka or Araki, which was thrown down onto the seabed but managed to remain partially above the surface. Regardless of which origin story in which region, the land and sea are considered seamless extensions of each other, with some land areas rising above the water. Oral traditions provide the reference point to intrinsic associations, the values, beliefs, and knowledge of the people who claim origins from it. They also explain the extrinsic associations, the lifeways, cultural practices, governing and management of resources, including people, and in order to survive and prosper intergenerationally. The ancestors in charge of these realms are constantly battling for dominance at the interface of land and sea. These are our shorelines, estuaries, wetlands, mangrove areas, seagrass meadows, for example. As the human element within these realms, we are constantly reminded to maintain respectful relationships in how we engage. We're not in control, but merely players in the greater scheme of things. The lessons we are taught have been transmitted through oral traditions and stories, and then established a pattern of experiential knowledge, practices, and processes for economic, cultural, social, and environmental intergenerational sustainability and growth. In the context of climate change, then, there are other sets of knowledge that merge with Indigenous knowledge frameworks, which resulted from relationships established when other peoples came within the sphere of each Indigenous nation. And I'll return to those in a later part of the presentation. But the merger of these parallel knowledge frameworks provides the co-production of knowledge for meeting contemporary and future challenges head-on. This knowledge co-production will become more important as resources are contested both within and from without the Pacific region. So a key concept then, that in the Pacific, land and sea are seamless extensions, and a concept that reflects the Indigenous knowledge framework of origins, connections with our space within the greater land and sea realms of our ancestors. Either way, land and sea are one, and combine to create territories that are mapped, named, fought over, travelled over, and become a network of crisscrossing highways that linked and continue to link the relationships created over time. From an Indigenous perspective then, the territories have been determined from the first fishing up or throwing down, and the travelling and networking, the continued recognition of the mana whenua status of several groups. These continue to be regulated from relationships, obligations and reciprocity between resources and people, people and land, people and sea. And these are informed and referenced from past associations, practices and values. The peoples who travelled expanded their culture and relationships, but at the same time retained the connections, obligations and relationships with home people, homeland and cultural landscape. They retained an Indigenous knowledge-led perspective of Pacific space and place within it that defies the imposed limited perspective of small island nations, cultural loss and refugees. Seamless territory incorporating land and sea that has recognised boundaries, recognised governance and management, continuing relationships with other Pacific neighbours based on established obligations and responsibilities. A population that references identity to homeland while conducting a circular travelling, dwelling and returning pattern of association with it. This is the way Pacific peoples recognise their world and the places they occupy. And as Josephine stated, we will adapt rather than leave because the ancestral connections mean leaving would be a challenge. So the photo I've got up at the moment is, of course, an aerial shot of Te Waka o Aoraki. And you can see, I don't have a pointer, but here we go. Here's the broken waka that was forming the backbone of the land, and situated here in not quite the centre is Aoraki, the one who was sitting highest in the waka when it became part of the land. So you can clearly see the waka here, and from a throwing down perspective, the backbone of the South Island is what has formed this land that we call our home. To understand how we manage and engage with our environment, there are some key concepts that we need to understand. And I'm going to use Māori concepts or some Kaitahu concepts, but many have parallels across the Pacific. But being from Kaitahu, I'm more familiar with ours. So whakapapa determines the social order, the balance of responsibilities and obligations, the origins and importance of each relationship that comes within the economic, social, environmental and cultural sphere of each Māori community. Te akitanga is about responsibility of care to every other entity within our whakapapa, whether it be land, sea, rivers, birds, trees, fish, and so forth. Whakawhanaungataka manages the relationships by setting the rules for engagement within them. These are carried out under tikaka or tikanga, rules that are set out the right way to do things. This, combined with te akitaka, insists on mutually beneficial arrangements and practices, utilising the resources to best effect without compromising future sustainability for future generations. Spiritual beliefs and practices ensure that cultural values are upheld in culturally appropriate ways, seeking a balance between spiritual and physical, informing and underpinning the processes, relationships and the systems we use. In the mix too is regional diversity, informed by local environmental conditions. That means there is no one Māori way, but relates directly to how each individual community understands and implements their values, knowledge and practices. Okay. So the term Indigenous knowledge then is about holistic economic, social, environmental and cultural factors all being considered. So it's a holistic form of knowledge. It's about interconnectedness between everything that comes within the worldview of those peoples, and in our case, within the whakapapa. It's sometimes, it used to be orally transmitted and still is to some extent, but of course we've also adopted, like everybody else, a written form, and of course social media is another way that we keep in touch. It's locally referenced, it's environmentally referenced, and I've already spoken about regional diversity that transmits knowledge, institutions, values and practices from one generation to the next. The key to the importance of understanding the interconnectedness is, of course, knowledge, and the term Indigenous knowledge is often used interchangeably with traditional ecological knowledge because of that environmental factor. Now, Indigenous knowledge in Aotearoa New Zealand is known as Martotaka Maori, which is basically a set of values and practices that can be attributed to a Maori way of knowing the world, that is a Maori worldview. And this is not necessarily couched in local knowledge though. For that, we need to think about Martotaka a iwi. Dr. Wiremu Doherty coined the term Martotaka a iwi because to recognise that there is no one Māori way. It is a regional specific because of course it's based in whakapapa and the relationships that have built up over time. He refers to it as grounded in an environmentally located base that creates inseparable strands between people and the environment that they live in, and the integration of people and the environment develops mutual understanding and collective practices that grow through the generations, thus giving us Māori ecological knowledge or iwi-specific knowledge for managing the relationships. Burke also argues that this should be seen as a process rather than content, and it is not a scientific versus traditional knowledge debate. It's not an either or, but rather as an as well as. With Māori now sharing their territories with others, it is a science and traditional knowledge coming forth as a partnership, and the challenges presented by climate change offer the opportunity for this combination to occur. Indeed, in my own region, we work closely in partnership with the Otago University Marine Science School to monitor our rivers, coastlines and sea territories. So the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change identified that Indigenous knowledge is an important, yet to date overlooked component of its previous work and assessments, that is its various reports, and confirmed that it will focus on local knowledge regarding the impacts of climate change and variability, thus stressing the overlooked but highly significant value of local knowledge, particularly in the Pacific and other areas where there are small island countries. They also identified that New Zealand had made scant leeway in adaptation and recommended that any mitigation needed to work alongside adaptation to ensure effective planning and strategies to minimise the impact from climate change. This combined effort is what has been happening in several Indigenous communities that I spoke briefly about in slide 2. So what will impact us mostly here? Okay, so Aotearoa New Zealand is also part of the Polynesian Triangle and thus a neighbour to the Pacific Island countries. We've not as yet been a particularly good neighbour in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but we are working on it. And as such, New Zealand is part of what is happening to other Pacific Island countries who are feeling the impacts of climate change. That said, we've also been part of some of the solutions by providing funding, and we'll look at some of those a little bit later. Aotearoa New Zealand is an industrialised country, and that's part of the problem, and to date has not really been part of the solution in terms of adaptation. We've yet to meet our greenhouse gas emissions targets, and yet to offer any real solutions or adaptation strategies either at home or to the Pacific Island countries that we share the Southern Pacific with. The Zero Carbon Bill, however, proposes a two-pronged approach to mitigating our greenhouse gases by slowly merging agricultural emissions within the ETS. Adaptation measures are short on detail, however, but may become more understood when the full report's eventually released, and I checked this morning and it still wasn't on the website. So what will impact us most here and across the Pacific and amongst small island countries in the world? And for it's been identified here that it'll be three main impacts: sea level rise, flooding and wildfires. And some of you will recognise that this is St Clair on a particularly stormy winter day, and I got pretty wet when that water came barrelling along the wall and hoed on top of me, but never mind. I dried out the cell phone and we moved on. So we have these three areas that have been identified by the IPCC report and also by some of our own scientists. And for us, Ngāi Tahu in particular, we commissioned NIWA to provide reports on how each of the 18 Rūnaka regions will be most impacted. There is also a Takiwide report that helped inform our climate change strategy. We have a tribal strategy, and we are also developing individual Rūnaka strategies that will guide us in meeting the challenges to our region. Some areas will be drier and others wetter. Increased storm surges and winds, warmer soil temperatures, and fresh water and arable land will become problematic, thus impacting our drinking water and food sustainability. And we really need to stop covering our food producing lands with houses, or if we do that, then we need to turn to something that Singapore's been quite successful in, and that's developing food production in high-rise buildings through hydroponics. There's other countries that have been doing that as well. They're also creating land there and reducing the number of cars on the road through incredibly high taxes, such as a tax of 100,000 Singaporean dollars if you buy a car, a fossil fuel driven car. And they've developed future forward planning for housing, infrastructure, creating living green walls and spaces to help cool buildings in the immediate environs, and have a 40-year plan. That's actually pretty impressive, and is something that they're actually sticking to. They've got a plan and that's what they're working towards. In the Pacific, for example, Niue has 2 hydroponic farms currently to reduce reliance on imported foods, and other countries are also looking at those ways of encouraging the development of food and food sustainability. We need to take heed also of how planning and action are occurring closer to home. In particular, how Pacific Island countries are renegotiating their relationships in their home environments to adjust and adapt management and processes. And I've got some examples. Adaptation then meaning assessing the appropriate adaptive capacity for vulnerable resources and landscapes, and the ability of a system to use these resources effectively in pursuit of adaptation. So recognising future tipping points and the feedback loops that create them, the processes of change that gradually or not accelerate until they overcome and become the dominant force and push a resource over the edge that could perhaps been overcome from adjusting to a new management regime. This requires the ability to have strong, flexible decision-making, some based upon past experiences that provide lessons for the present about overcoming challenge and change. It also requires the flexibility for future adjustment and capacity. Flexible decision-making and leadership is inherent within an Indigenous knowledge framework, because fundamental to Indigenous knowledge is about managing relationships. If a relationship is abused or ignored to benefit one above the other, then there are consequences. The subservient partner can either give in and subject to the new relationship state, or work to regain a more mutually beneficial relationship once again. So learning to live with the consequences, working or adjusting to make sure we can live within the world we have created in culturally, socially, environmentally and economically appropriate ways. Now, in the past, early Polynesian settlers to New Zealand adjusted to New Zealand conditions quite adequately. They relied on knowledge that they had from their previous homelands, and they developed new systems and processes to enable more beneficial relationships with this new land that they came to. They developed new planting and harvesting methods. They modified soils and growing conditions. They created land for villages and agriculture, and were flexible in terms of tikanga to meet new circumstances as they presented themselves. They adjusted and they adapted their relationships. So moving forward to now, Pacific Island countries are using these past processes to establish new rules for engagement, new ways to live with the changed relationships that have been created largely not of their own making. As Jenny Bryant-Tukulao explains, in the Pacific, many of the tradition-based responses of climate change evolved over centuries and are often more appropriate than the current technical fix response to the inundation, droughts and major storms. These include artificial islands approach, the creation of land and responses to flooding and hurricanes. Some, such as Tuvalu, have looked to resettlement options in neighbouring island countries. So some of the things that have been happening. Okay, so I spoke earlier about the Native Indian Research Centre's report and the benefit of Indigenous climatological knowledge. And so in Vanuatu, there's a weather project which combines the work of the National Meteorological Centre and village elders who are steeped in traditional knowledge on weather observations, patterns, and how better to use those patterns to predict future events. So they look at what are the signs, how have we recognised changing patterns in the past, and what did we do about it, and so forth. Other things that have been happening are the management or changing management system for seagrass meadows and mangrove areas. These occur, if you remember, at the interface between land and sea, and in the past were often big providers of food sources for peoples who lived in those areas. And they were used in the past, but not so popular now. And I remember one of my Pacific Island students telling me that his grandmother still goes down and harvests stuff from their seagrass meadows, and she can't understand why the young ones don't want to do it. And he said it's probably because, you know, we're used to just popping down to the shop and buying whatever's been imported. But they may not be so popular now, but we need to renegotiate those relationships that we have with these types of land. And another important thing about them is they're also big carbon sink areas. There's also the development of hurricane crops, which I think I've got up there. In other words, over time, they've decided or discovered which crops best survive through the hurricane season, and been planting more of those as those seasons come up, so that they have some food and that they're not totally reliant on waiting for the imported foods to come in through as part of the disaster relief. Raising houses onto stilts, floating houses, creating new land, all these new technologies to protect and rebuild their lands, their housing, and their livelihoods. And technology is also being used too to help rebuild the first lines of defence, which for many small island countries are their coral reefs. And we have 3D printed coral or modular artificial reef structures. And a good example of these, which I'll show you in a minute, is on the Summer Island Resort in the Maldives. And it also includes coral reef farming, because reefs protect against storm surges and protect environments as well as provide food sources. But as reef design labs warn, their modular artificial reef structures cannot fix bleaching and increase acidification, but can facilitate needed research on reef restoration and resilience. And I've got some photos of those. Oh, talked about that. Okay, so 3D printed coral, who'd have thought? So originally made with artificial materials, but now they're starting to use materials from the countries themselves and from the sands and things within those countries, so that they're more natural, if you like. And they encourage the growth of reefs. And this one, as I said, is in the Maldives at Summer Island Resort. But Australia, the scientists in Australia are also looking at this process for helping to repair the Great Barrier Reef. The next photo is of Niue. It's the solar power grid at their power station. And they also have another bank of solar power at the airport. The high schools run, and the village surrounding the high school are run from solar panels on the roof of the high school. And there's various other places around the island where they've been utilising solar power. And they're not alone across the Pacific. There's a number of other Pacific Island countries that have alternative power. And you only need to go and look on their websites and you'll see their alternative energy and renewable energy policies and strategies, and some of them are quite comprehensive. We may also consider becoming ecotourists by participating in the various projects around restoration of coral reefs, such as coral reef farming and adopt a coral. And one way to justify those carbon miles perhaps ramped up to go touristing. But in effect, there are several resorts in the Caribbean, however you like to say it, have little projects for their visitors, their guests, where they can go and purchase a piece of coral which is put into a process of farming, and then when there's enough built in the grid, they replant it out in the reef to try and help the restoration of that reef. So, you know, there are a number of things that are happening that anyone can be involved in. So it's really up to people to find ways to repair the relationships they've damaged, and these may involve a shared or parallel pathway of knowledge that co-produce solutions, or at the very best or least, develop ways to adjust and adapt to the changed landscapes and the changed lived realities, which will be the lived reality for everyone pretty shortly. Some environments have already adjusted themselves and adapted to changed conditions that they find themselves in. So we can learn too from natural adaptation that is taking place, particularly on our river. We had we learnt from the way that our whitebait or our inaka have adapted to the loss of the wetland spawning areas, and just some of the ways that they've adjusted to the new conditions that they've found themselves in. Many live, though, in fragile spaces that only need a small change to create a disaster, such as the reef bleaching. So just to sum up, temporarily, this disaster has been created by people, and we need to adapt and adjust to the new environment that's been created for us. We've upset the balance and upset the relationships and are in periods of transition where we can either succumb or look towards Indigenous knowledge frameworks to help with finding solutions as advocated by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Part of that adaptation includes adopting technology, and this has been effectively utilised alongside Indigenous knowledge in wider Pacific and other Indigenous communities. Pacific communities are unevenly challenged by the impacts, not of their own making, and large industrial nations have responsibilities and obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. But this does not mean that they have the solutions. As we saw with the weather mapping in Vanuatu, there needs to be parallel knowledge system and processes working alongside to ensure full benefit and potential through adjusting management processes and systems. Flexible decision making and technology are all part of the mix. But it's up to the Pacific Island countries to determine the speed and level of transition based on knowledge they've accumulated in the past to adjust to environmental disasters. The natural order of things has been interrupted and the changes artificially accelerated. New rules for engagement need to be negotiated, and Pacific Island peoples will continue to dwell in the Pacific. In the past, Pacific peoples have created new land, built homes according to the environment, and moved inland or to other islands until the impact from the disaster has passed. Indeed, Paul Darcy documents in his work, The People of the Sea, how past relationships were called upon to help with temporary relocation during environmental disasters. And once the environment had, changed or returned or, repaired itself in the homeland, people returned to begin again. So they were only ever temporary relocations. Just as a warning about not referring to peoples as refugees, because it's easier to think of them as dependent and helpless when they do not think of themselves as such. We need to listen and take heed of how Pacific peoples are adapting and changing to re-establish themselves in a beneficial relationship with their environment. It may be that the world can't minimise the impact from fossil fuels and other greenhouse gases, that we cannot hold the warming to 1.5, maximum 2 degrees. Then and only then will people such as Josephine's whānau consider that they may have to think about leaving. But in the meantime, Pacific countries are fighting against the notion that they are helpless, they, like other Indigenous communities and countries, have been working with adjusting to climate change impacts for over 40 years. Their knowledge is at the forefront of how they interrelate with their environment and is providing solutions based on past experience, informing present circumstances that will lead future negotiation with the climate. And yes, they utilise technology, scientific skills and research, but on their own terms and in ways that don't impact on their cultural integrity. So renegotiate relationships to ensure they continue to live in the new environment that's been created through ignoring the consequences of actions against the ancestral realms. Aotearoa New Zealand has its own substantial body of regionally based Indigenous knowledge, where local experience-based knowledge has led change when new challenges present themselves. Māori are well placed to help lead in New Zealand by utilising Martotaka. We can also benefit from wider Pacific practices and strategies already in place. This requires a shift in thinking that it is only science that can lead us through the coming decades. As has been experienced in areas where Indigenous knowledge has already been given significant space in planning and strategies, we need to start thinking how Aotearoa New Zealand can utilise Martotaka to achieve substantial inroads in the new environments we are now encountering. Aotearoa New Zealand cannot afford to ignore the wealth of intergenerational knowledge and practices that have accumulated as part of a suite of knowledge frameworks to create a new lived reality. By utilising Martotaka strengths and knowledge, we can face the new assault from climate change head on. Kia ora.